All right, welcome back. I've changed my mind, and I'm actually not going to show how to animate the model box in this tutorial. I might just make a different tutorial, maybe in 1 or 2 weeks, on how to do CSS animations. If you all are interested in that, we can talk more about it in class because I think we have buffer for 1 or 2 technical tutorials in the latter part of class that I haven't decided yet what they're going to be. So that could be one option. So we're going to go even deeper into creating interactions with JavaScript, and I've actually started a new project, same deal as before, empty project. I've deleted everything except for the title, the CSS inclusion, and the script inclusion, and then the script is empty and the CSS just has the sans serif font family on the body. This is not necessary, it's just my personal preference. And in this tutorial, we're actually going to build a to-do list, a very simple and rudimentary version of a to-do list, but it's going to have the functionality of adding an element to the list and then of checking off items from the list itself, right? So like a very bare bones version of what a to-do list could look like. And I'm going to start by just adding a small title to our to-do list. Let's say H4 my to-do list. I'm going to have it all on the same line. And then let's create a container for it, right? So div class equals to-do list container. And if we think about it kind of at a high level, a to-do list has two large user interface elements. The first one is the list itself, right, which displays what items we have on the list. And the second one is a place where the user can add new items to this list, right? So I'm going to create one div for each one of these, right? So div class equals items list, and then another one that's going to be where the user actually inputs the new items, user input. All right, so we don't see anything yet because these are just containers and they are empty. And what's going to happen is that this items list is going to get populated with many other small divs, which are going to represent the items that the user is adding to the list. And we'll start with actually creating this user input. And in order to do that, we're going to use a new kind of HTML element, which is the input element. Inputs is the input tag, right? It's just like the thing that allows you to type stuff inside of an HTML page. You see it all over the place on the internet. This is what it is. I'll say type equals text. There's many different types of inputs. Mostly they have to do with formatting, like it can be type for a phone number or email address, and then HTML kind of does some nice things in the back and only allows users to type that specific kind of text. We're allowing for any type of text, so it's totally fine. I'm also going to give it an ID and say input box. And I'm going to give it a class as well. Class equals input box. Okay, so we have our input, we can type in it, but nothing happens quite yet. So aside from this, we also want a button, right? Like kind of a submit button that the user would click on, and then the element gets removed from the input box and added to the list. And for that, we can just use the button element again. Button type equals button, and we'll just say add to list. Okay, great. So we have our user interface for adding things to the list. However, nothing is working yet. Oh, let's also give our button an ID. ID equals add to list button. And let's start creating some JavaScript to make sure the button is working, to figure out how to access the text inside of the input field from our button, and so on. So I'm going to transition towards our script.js file. And as usual, I'm going to start with the DOM content loaded event. So window.add event listener DOM content loaded, and then the second parameter is the function that we place all of our code in. And in here, we want to do a bunch of things. First of all, we want to listen to the click event on our button, right? In order to do that, we need to get the element by ID and then add the event listener, which is what we've done so many times already in the previous tutorial. So var add to list button equals document.get element by ID. I always forget these IDs. Add to list button. I'm just going to copy paste it. Okay, document get element by ID, add to list button, and then add to list button, add event listener. Right, we're listening for the click event yet again, and we're going to create a function that's called onAddToList, which is going to, which we're gradually going to build to add elements to our list. So let's create our function, and let's start with the console log as usual to make sure that we typed everything correctly on add to list. I'm going to open my console and clear all these errors. Okay, so we click the button and we see the onAddToList message, which means that our function is executing properly, so that is great. Alright, so in terms of the logic that needs to happen whenever the user clicks on this button, first of all, we need to get a hold of the text that's in this text box, right? And then we need to turn that text somehow into an element that will become part of this larger div and kind of add it to our running list. In order to get a hold of the text inside of our text box, we need to, again, get the HTML elements of the text box and then access one particular property on that element, which will give us exactly what we need. And that is the value property. So let's say var input box element equals document, right? So I'm just getting the HTML element for the input box, get element by ID, and the name of that was just input box. And the way, as I was saying, the way to access the text inside is by just saying input box element dot value, right? So this is going to give us the text. However, we need to assign this to a variable, right? So we'll say var list item equals input box element dot value, and let's print this to the console so we make sure that it's working. Console log list item is, and then list item. Okay, so let's say buy bananas. Right, so we see we see our element in here. Maybe what we would like, the functionality is not there yet, right? Like what we would expect is to have this under there, go in the list and disappear from here, but we are getting there. For now, we just have the text, which is great. So let's get to the second part of this, which is bringing it from our input box inside of our list. And the way we're going to do that is by getting a hold of this container from JavaScript, which means that we also need to give it an ID. So I'm just going to say ID equals items list container. And then programmatically from JavaScript, create elements for each one of the items that the user is adding. Right, so it would be kind of like saying div item 1, div item 2, and so on, but do this from JavaScript as opposed to us writing this code. All right, so the way that works is like this. At first, we need to get the element, so I'm going to copy its ID. So I'll say var list container equals document get element by ID, and I'm going to paste it, right? Items list container. And as I said, we need to create a new HTML element for each item that gets added to our list. And the way to do that is by using the document.createElement function. So we'll say var new list item equals document create element. And this takes one parameter, which is the type of element that you want to create. In our case, we can do a div. All right, so we've created a new div. We need to place our content inside of this div, and then we need to add this div onto the container. One super easy way of placing our content inside of the div is by using this property called inner HTML. So if we say new list item dot inner HTML equals list item, this will set just the raw HTML content inside of this div to be equal to our string. And I'm going to show you, you're going to see in a second what that means. And now the final thing that we need to do is to add this div onto the container. And the way we do that is by saying list container dot append child new list item. Right, so append child adds an element to a parent kind of at the end of its list of children. So if we did everything properly, we should start seeing, right, so we see our buy bananas element in here. Let's do an inspect element. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Right, so we have our container. We have our container over there, the buy bananas, and then we have one div inside with the content of the text that we gave it. So let's try doing another one. Buy milk. I'm going to add it to the list. Right, and do my programming.net homework. Right, so this is starting to look a little bit like a to-do list. We still need to add some CSS. We still need to be able to check elements of the list, but we're slowly getting there. Right, so I hope it's clear so far. We create a new div. We add some text to it as its inner HTML, which literally means this, right? Like exactly what goes inside of the div. And then we append the div to the entire list. All right, great. So the next thing that I want to do is actually make this part of the text, make the inputs disappear once you add something to the list, right? Like right now it's pretty annoying in that it stays there and then the user can make the mistake of clicking on the button multiple times and the item shows up in there. So the way we're going to do that is once we get the value of the inputs of the input box element, we can also set it to the empty string. So if we just say input box element dot value equals to the empty string. Right, so in this scenario, whenever we add something to the list, the input box becomes clear. Right? And right now, yeah, if we click add to list, nothing happens. I'm not quite sure why that is, because I think we should be adding some empty divs, which did happen, right? Like you see, we're just adding empty divs right now. However, since they don't have any content, they are not showing. They're not showing up. They will have a height of 0. We could also kind of prevent against this scenario by having an if statement. Right, so if we wanted our list to not get spammed with empty divs, if the user keeps hitting add to list when the text box is empty, we could just say if list item is equal to the empty string, then simply return. Right, so return is a statement very similar to C and C++, where if we have return here in the function, the rest of the function does not get executed, and we just exit. So let's try again. I'll have a random string. I'll do inspect element. We have a div, and then if we keep hitting add to list, you see there's no more empty divs over there. All right, cool. So this first part of the list is working, and now we should do. Actually, let's do a little bit of styling first, and then we're gonna get to the second part, which is being able to check off items from our list. So for the styling, I'm actually going to refresh this and add maybe like two divs to the list, just so we can work with them from CSS. Just div class equals item number 1, and then I'll do the same for an item number 2. All right, so what should we do with the style? First, let's add a margin top to the user input, so we get a little bit of spacing over there. Let's say margin top 20 pixels. Great. Let's also give it a let's actually center the whole thing on the page, right? Just like the whole to-do list. That we could do by giving this container a fixed width, right? So if we just say to-do list container, if we gave it a width of 300 pixels, and then we set margin auto, this is going to sort of center it in the body, right? Like if we also give it a background color, so we see what's happening. Right, we see we have a margin to the left and the margin to the right. And whenever we resize the screen, our to-do list stays at the same width and the margins adjust themselves dynamically. This trick works for centering stuff inside of the body, for centering any kind of like other inner divs and nested divs. Display flex is usually the better option. Okay, so I'm going to remove the background for now. Let's maybe give it a border just so we see where it is. And let's give it a padding so the border is not stuck to the items, and I'll just say 15 pixels. Okay, great. And we could center the title as well. Or actually we could just place the title inside of the container. Okay, that works. Okay, and now let's say we want to give each individual item a little bit more space and kind of give it a rectangular border. So we're going to work with the item class, right? We have them defined here, and we're just going to say padding top 5 pixels, padding bottom 5 pixels, right? So just give them a little bit of space. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier in the to-do list container, I used the property padding without specifying top, bottom, left, or right. If you just say padding and give it one value, it's going to apply the same padding to all four directions of the layout. Let's give it the border. And maybe let's give them padding left, so the text is not stuck to the border. And just give it maybe 3. And let's have a little bit of spacing in between them so that we don't get that ugly double border. And again, this is a pretty horrible looking design, but bear with me. This is more about the functionality than about how it looks. So we'll say maybe margin top again 3 pixels, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, yeah, I guess we could work with that. All right, great. So now we want the interaction where oh, first of all, so we've done all of this stuff, but when we click add to list for a new item, it doesn't get styled because in JavaScript we're not specifying the item class on the new element that we're adding, right? So before adding the child to the container, we also want to give it the class, right? And we've done that in the previous tutorial. We just say new list item dot set attribute, and we want to set the class attribute to the value item, which is the class name that we've created. So now if we set item number 3, it would get added just like the previous ones. All right, great. So yeah, now we're finally ready to create the interaction where we click on an item and it gets crossed as a sign of it being resolved, being done. And the way to do that is by adding event listeners for click to all of these newly created divs, right? So whenever we create a new div, we also attach an event listener to it. And from that click event listener, we change the styling of the text inside of the div to be crossed out, or maybe we change the background color, or we do other changes to the div. And the way to do that would be like this, right? So we have the new list item. In a similar way to how we've added click event listeners before, we'll just say new list item dot add event listener, and we say click, and then we say on item click, which is a function that doesn't exist yet, which we need to create. So we go all the way to the top and we say function on item click. Okay, so we've added event listeners. Let's do a console log to make sure that item clicks are working. I'm actually going to open it in a new window because having the console here is too intense. Okay, so these original 2 items, we wrote them in HTML and we didn't add an event listener to them. We're only adding event listeners to the items added dynamically from JavaScript, right? So the first 2 don't print any message. However, the third one is printing the item click is working. And we can add a 4th one and the fifth one. So we click on them, but we're getting the same message for all of them, right? Because we only have one single function, that's the event listener. However, whenever we click on one, we need to cross out only that one element in particular, not all of them, right? So it's a little different from what we had before, where we could just do document.getElement by ID for our modal box and show it or hide it, right? Now it's getting a little bit funkier. And the way to deal with this problem is the following. Whenever we have an event listener, we have a function that's being called by our click event. We used it without any parameters so far. However, it usually sends the user one parameter, which is the actual event that's being fired. And that has details about the click, where on the page that click was, what element you clicked on, and so on. If you're familiar with C and C++, this is going to be a complete mindfuck to you, in the sense that C and C++ are so strict about the parameters of their function. However, in JavaScript, if parameters come to your function, but you don't specify them, then it's fine, right? Like you just don't use them and they're still there. However, the moment we say event in here, we're going to have this parameter that we are printing to the console, and we can take a look at what's inside of it. So I'm gonna click. So we see over here this thing that's called a pointer event. And there's a bunch of stuff. Client X and client Y are the position of this click event on the screen. Offset X, offset Y, page X, page Y, kind of similar properties. Screen X, screen Y. These are all kind of like the same measurement but different. Right? They all relate to where you are on the screen, where the screen was clicked, but some refer to the position of the element itself, others refer to whether the page is scrolled or not. It's just a matter of like experimenting with them and figuring out which works. However, what we want for solving our problem of figuring out which element in particular was clicked is this target property. So this target property, you see it's a div which shows us exactly what was clicked. So if I click, let's clear this. If I click on item 4, open the event and go to the target property, it's going to highlight item 4. Right, I'm gonna hide it. If I click on item 3 and go to the target property, it's gonna highlight 3. So we're gonna use this event.target thing in order to get a hold of the HTML of the element that we clicked on, right? As opposed to what we did before, which was document.getElement by ID, because these items don't have IDs. So let's say var current item equals event.target. And let's say we want to change the styling of that item to have the text crossed out, which I actually don't remember how to do, so I'm gonna have to Google it. CSS Strikethrough. Okay, so it's the text decoration CSS property. So we can just say for now current item dot style for text decoration equals, and it said line dash through. Line through. Okay, so I'm gonna go into index and actually remove the 2 fake elements from our list. Programming the net tutorial number 1, tutorial number 2, and send emails. That's my to-do list for tonight. So now if I click on the first one, you see that the text gets crossed out, right? Which means that I have completed those tasks. If we click again, nothing happens, right? Like the same CSS gets applied again of having it crossed. right? So if we wanted to bring it back to the not done state, we would have to implement a little bit of logic inside of our script, where we would have an if statement and ask, right, like in the same way that we did with showing and hiding the circle, we could kind of check if the current style is line through. For text decoration, that means it's checked and we want to bring it back to the default state. Right, so let's do that. Let's say if current item dot style, I'm just going to copy this for text decoration, is equal to line through. That means the element is in the done state and we need to bring it back. So we're going to make it none, which is the default state of no text decoration. Otherwise, if it's in the normal state, we want to bring it to the line through. Right, so if you click once, it crosses. If you click again, it's back, right? Okay, so that works. And now we could do like a few more cosmetic tweaks, right? Like we could make our cursor be a pointer when we hover over the items. So if we go into the CSS, we could just say cursor pointer. Which makes a little bit more sense from a user interaction perspective. We could maybe have hover states for each one of the elements so that it's easier to see which one you're on top of. So for that, we would use the CSS hover. So we could say item hover background color light yellow. Tutorial 2, tutorial 3. Right, so now we have the hover for each one of our elements of the to-do list. What else could we do? We could maybe change the background color for when an element is already done. So we would have both the strike through and maybe like a red background color. So we could do that too inside of our script. We could say also current item style for background color equals red. Oh, transparent for when we're transitioning into the not done state, and let's say red for when it's done. Let's see if that works. Item 1, item 2. Right, so now it's red and we see that the hover doesn't function anymore, and that is because we gave it a background color property later than defining the hover in CSS, right? So the new property we defined in JavaScript takes precedence, which is good to remember. So I'm actually going to remove this feature for now. And maybe the last thing that I am going to add is to be able to add elements to our to-do list by just hitting enter on the keyboard, right? Like right now, if I hit enter, nothing happens. I just have to click the button every time. So let's do it such that whenever the user types, if they hit enter on the keyboard, a new element gets added. And in order to do that, we're going to have to listen for a keyboard event. And keyboard events are not attached to any divs or any parts of the page, right? Because the keyboard is completely independent from what's on the screen. So they actually end up being attached to the window. So we would say window add event listener. I always forget which one to use. There's a bunch of different events for the keyboard. I think it's key press, but let me double check. Okay, so key press is no longer recommended. Key up. There we go. Okay, great. So we'll say window add event listener, key up, and create a function on keyboard press. So we can create our function here on keyboard press. We can take the event parameter as well, and let's print it to the console. Right, so right now I'm pressing the letter F on my keyboard, so we're getting a keyboard event, which tells us the key that was pressed, which is lowercase f, the key code that's associated with the lowercase f, and a bunch of other properties. I'm going to press a 1 and a 2 and capital R and the shift. What we care for is pressing enter. So I'm going to press enter, and let's see, the key code for enter is 13. So what we want to do inside of our on keyboard press is check if the user pressed enter, and if they did, do exactly the same thing that we do when the user clicks on the button. Right, so I'll say if event.keycode, which is what we looked at earlier, is equal to 13. And then we can actually just call on add to list the function. Right, so it's exactly, we want it to do exactly the same thing that it does when the user clicks on the button. Right, so let's try. I'll just say item number 1 and hit enter, and it worked, right? Like it just added item 1. I'm just gonna hit enter a bunch of times with the empty text box. Nothing happens, which is great. Item number 2, item number 3, and item number 4. Okay, and we cross them all off, and done. We're done with this tutorial. Yeah, that's our basic to-do list. As usual, feel free to reach out if you have any technical questions about any of the things that went on in this tutorial. Right, we covered quite a bit of ground. We covered mouse and keyboard events. We covered creating elements from within JavaScript. We covered attaching event listeners to elements that were created from within JavaScript. Right, so we're getting quite deep within the realm of interaction. Yeah, hope you enjoyed the assignment, and yeah, feel free to reach out if anything doesn't make sense. Thank you.